Representative Sampson.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. As the distinguished chairman of the Insurance Committee stated, the amendment before us is a strike-all amendment to replace the bill. We intend to have a debate upon the language that's before us, but I suspect that the amendment will pass. I would even encourage its support since it does improve the underlying bill, though I don't advocate for passage of the final bill at this time. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson of the 80th, sir, you have the floor.
Good evening, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by saying that I appreciate the comments from my colleague on the Insurance Committee, and I agree with a great deal of what he said. Certainly, there is no one in this room, and probably no one that we know personally, that wants to see anyone go without access to health care or to be turned away if they are faced with a medical condition or any of those unfortunate circumstances that sadly happen every day in our world. But that's kind of my point, because much of this, and in fact I think the first portion of the bill, it was explained, merely codifies a portion of the Affordable Care Act in our state statute. And even though that exists, many of these same situations continue to occur. The representative was correct when he said that each one of us has had our constituents come to us with concerns about the cost of their health care insurance and access to health care. And again, precisely my point. The reason why people are coming to us is because they are very unhappy with the current situation. And this particular bill before us, while it does some good things, one of the things it does is it takes and puts the current situation into our state law so that even if the federal government decides to end Obamacare, which I would argue is the source of many of the problems that people come to me concerned with, we will still have it here. This debate is going to be about a lot of things, but the number one thing it's going to be about is the difference in ideology between the political parties. My colleague, and I think many of his fellow Democratic representatives, would argue that we would all be better off if insurance policies were broad, covered a tremendous number of things, and therefore no one would ever go without a certain type of coverage. And that sounds like a wonderful and great thing. The problem is that we live in a world where things are not free, that someone has to pay for those things. He spoke about value. What are our values? And I would say it's a good value to want to make sure that people have a good insurance policy. But another value we have in this country that goes back way before insurance, in fact, is the value of freedom. The value that people have in being able to make their own choice about what they do in their life. And that, I would argue, includes having the opportunity, the option, to make their own choices, and particularly about health care, and even more particularly when it comes to women. I hear a lot of talk about having respect for people of different genders and religions, races. I want that as much as any other person. And I want it so badly that I try every day to make sure that people understand that the best way to achieve equality among people is to stop putting them into categories, to stop saying a bill for women, the LGBTQ community, Stop saying those things. They're all people. They are our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones. And this bill concerns me because it is an intersection of a great many things. And one of those things is identity politics. The very title of this bill says, expanding mandated health benefits for women. I think that's a laudable goal, but I also think that it's unfortunate that this bill calls out one gender versus the other when we should be trying to make sure that there is access and quality health care for all persons. I have a few questions, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the ideology behind this proposal as things become clear. I just want to make sure, through you, Mr. Speaker, that I heard the chairman correct when he stated that the first part of this bill basically puts a significant provision of the Affordable Care Act into Connecticut statute. Is that correct, through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes, that is correct. And I would remind my good friend, Representative Sampson, that the essential health benefits package that is in the first and second section of this bill applies to men, women, and children. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer very much. Thank you. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands this correctly, that part of this bill's provision is to make sure that the failed policy that has driven up insurance premiums thousands of dollars and cost our constituents stress, the potential of going out without insurance, ridiculously high deductibles for those that own businesses large and small, the potential of having to lay off employees or reduce their benefits. Those things come from Obamacare. And why we would want to put them in our state law is beyond me. Obamacare is a failure. We all know this. It is the reason why our insurance is so expensive. Does anyone remember when President Obama promised us all that premiums would be reduced $2,000 a person? I remember that. Did it happen? No, it didn't. In fact, we have record insurance premiums. They are through the roof. And why are they so expensive? It's for a combination of reasons. But one of the main ones is that we are trying to do a laudable thing that is impossible to do, which is to provide things that are not free for free. Healthcare costs money, and people have to make decisions about what they're going to have for healthcare. And in the case of Obamacare, the government decided for everyone. You are going to have all this insurance whether you want it or not. And consequently, you will pay for it whether you want it or not. Again, this is the fundamental ideological difference between the parties. I want people to be able to have access to everything and anything under the sun, but I want it to be their choice to decide whether they want it or not. I don't want a state government or a federal government to tell me what insurance product I am supposed to purchase. That should be up to me and my family. So what is the danger of putting this essential health benefits package in our law? Well, today, there's no danger to it because we are living under this right now, as I just reminded everyone. And as was pointed out, the purpose of this bill is to make sure that if those, and I'm using quotes here, terrible people in Washington somehow undo Obamacare, that we will still have it here. But what including these coverages in our state law means is that if the federal government repeals Obamacare, other states are going to be able to go ahead and adapt, and they're going to be able to go back to doing the things necessary to make insurance affordable and accessible to everyone. And we will be stuck with the same failed policy that's going on right now across the country. Essentially, this removes flexibility from insurance carriers from being able to offer products that they want. It stops them from putting together plan designs that make sense for their particular customers. The good news is that this doesn't affect every one of our neighbors. In fact, it doesn't affect us in this room because we are on a self-insured plan. And I'm told it only affects around 30% of the marketplace. But the bad news is that it does affect the exact same people that are struggling to pay their insurance now, which are individuals who are buying insurance on their own and small group insurance policies that small businesses purchase. I'm concerned that we are essentially going to tie the hands of a future legislature to be able to go ahead and adapt to the possibilities that would exist if we gave competition and the free market a chance. I'm sure that the chairman is aware that this is already underway on the federal level. HHS has recently created a new policy where they offer guidance to the states where they can choose to have flexibility on what individual states want to include for this essential health benefits package. It allows us to choose another state's benefit package if we think it might work better for our constituents. It allows us to replace a category or categories from another state's benchmark plan. Or it allows us to elect a different set of benefits from one of those plans. This by itself, even though it is not what I would ideally say is the best solution, it is the one we are offered right now by the federal government, which says, we know this Obamacare is not working. We know that we have put the states in a bind by making sure that they have to do this. Here's an opportunity to make some changes to maybe make it work better in your state. And we're not doing that. We are essentially just going to codify what's in the Affordable Care Act that we know does not work. As the chairman mentioned, the second part of this bill is the creation of new insurance mandates. And I'd just like to ask a question through you, Mr. Speaker, if the chairman might let us know exactly what the new mandates entail. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the only new mandate that I'm aware of in this entire bill deals with the contraception section, which is in section 11 and 12, dealing with allowing for the 12-month supply of contraception. I'm sure we'll get to contraception later, but as far as I'm aware, that is the only new mandate in this bill that is not currently covered under the Affordable Care Act. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that answer. I have to tell everyone that I've spent, some of today going over the many, many different versions of the bill that came out, and we made some different changes. And I want to just stop for a moment and say a brief word about my colleague, Representative Scanlon. He is a gentleman, and one of the people in this building that I appreciate the most. Because despite the fact that he and I have widely differing political views, I think he would agree with me, he has always been an honest broker, and he respects the fact that I have an ideology that differs from his, and that I represent a district that looks different than his, and for that purpose, we are not always going to agree. But we also recognize that we must treat each other with respect, and that there's no one here who is evil or against women or any other person. We just have different ways of looking at the world to try and achieve the best possible outcomes for all of our neighbors. And I'm saddened every day by how divisive politics has become. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned for myself and I'm concerned for my colleagues about what is going to happen after this bill passes or fails. And what's going to be said about the people based on how they vote. And that's unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, because it shouldn't be that way. We are here to debate the merits of public policy. And sadly, when politics enters this room and beyond, no one benefits. And it's not what our constituents want to see from us. I'll also say that this bill started off, in my opinion, much, much worse than it is now. And I want to just say a word to say that I am very appreciative for my colleague taking my recommendations and requests seriously. And of course, he did not deliver them all. Otherwise, we might not be having this debate. But he took a lot of them seriously, and some of them ended up in the final bill. And I appreciate that very, very much. When it comes to insurance mandates, there are a number of them listed in the bill before us. One of them I noticed says tobacco use intervention and cessation counseling for any woman who consumes tobacco. And I understand that under the Affordable Care Act, this is actually a coverage. I find it kind of interesting that we would actually tell insurance companies and consumers that they have to pay for this product whether they even smoke or not. But first let me ask the chairman through the speaker, is this exact coverage part of the current Affordable Care Act mandated coverages? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if he's correct, then that means that the current law says women. Tobacco use intervention cessation counseling for any woman who consumes tobacco. Is that correct through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes, that is correct.
Now Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm just curious, and I honestly don't know the answer to this question, but is there a similar provision for tobacco cessation counseling for men in the federal law or in our state law? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, yes, as part of the preventative health care section of the essential health benefits, there is a provision that says tobacco use screening for all adults and cessation interventions for tobacco users. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm curious to know why we listed this item B on line 96 and 97 to specify for any woman when it actually covers both. And I just would like to confirm for my own satisfaction and for the other members of this chamber, if the ACA went away on a federal level and this mandate no longer existed in our federal law, would this bill mean that only females would have this coverage in our current state law? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. I actually want to correct the record for my friend Representative Sampson. I misspoke. The exact wording of the women and, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, tobacco use intervention and cessation counseling for women who consumes tobacco, that is not actually in the text of the Affordable Care Act. What is in the text of the Affordable Care Act is a reference to recommendations of the United States Preventative Service Task Force. Within those recommendations, it recommends the language that we just discussed, in addition to what is discussed for men. We simply are spelling out the benefit for women here, but the benefit for men, when it comes to tobacco cessation, exists also within this bill, though indirectly. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the immediate section before it refers to domestic and interpersonal violence screening and counseling for any woman. And I'm curious if you could just answer the same question for me. Is the same coverage included for men in the ACA? And if the ACA went away, would it be included in our Connecticut law because of the bill before us? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is my understanding. Yes.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that. I will take the gentleman at his word. I tried very hard for a little while today to try and make sense out of what mandates exist on a federal level that we would be adapting here or not here. And since we've had so many different versions of the bill, I'm still not quite certain. There's also a concern that I've had about the types of insurance policies that are covered by this language before us. It's a very technical thing and something I don't understand even completely myself, despite being the ranking member of the Insurance and Real Estate Committee. But our statutes essentially treat different types of insurance products differently, whether they are sold to individuals, whether they are sold to small groups, or whether they are sold to large groups. And a large group might be defined as over 50 employees. And I understand that the ACA's essential health benefits package that is here has traditionally only been mandated for individuals and small groups. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is that the case here, or are we also including the mandate for essential health benefits for large group plans? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. That is correct. What we do here is we exempt large group plans from the essential health benefits portion of this bill, and we define small employers similar to how the ACA defines them as employers with not more than 50 employees. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer very much. However, I want to drill down on it a little bit because I noticed in the latest revision of the bill that we certainly did specify Section 1 having to do with individual plans, Section 2 having to do with small employers, but when it comes to the new insurance mandates, they are identified in Section 4 as each group health insurance policy, which in my mind means that they would apply to all types of insurance, including large group. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct for the sections that are not related to the essential health benefits, because in our estimation, that does not impact a substantial number of people on the large group side within those mandates, and therefore we did not believe that it required the same language as was applicable to the essential health benefits. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying to figure out the best way to go about this. There's two factors here. One of them is the extent to which the insurance mandates are increased, and then how much that would actually impact each of those different types of insurance plans. As far as contraception, which the good chairman mentioned was a significant portion of the new mandates, I understand that this proposal would expand the required amount of coverage that is afforded and mandated that every insurance policy sold must include and therefore be paid for by premium dollars from the policyholder from 3 months to 12 months. But I also understand that it expands the availability of different products. It used to be that the requirement would be for only one product to be offered, like one brand of birth control would be offered by the insurance carrier. And this looks like it would allow a policyholder to have access to any number of different brands and types of birth control, even at the same time. And I know it's an uncomfortable topic, and I don't really even want to get into it too much. I just want to see if I'm correct that we are pretty dramatically increasing the availability, not a good or bad thing in my mind, what products are available for birth control as a mandate. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I would interpret this differently than my friend, Representative Sampson. I would view it more that we are giving women options as to what they want to choose in terms of their, preferred form of contraception, or frankly, what form of contraception works best for them and their body, and therefore giving them more choices as opposed to less is something that I personally believe is good policy as opposed to bad policy. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the chairman mentioning that because he has a couple of times now said something that I really just have to call attention to. There is nothing in this bill about choice, respectfully. We might be offering a consumer the choice for what type of drugs they might choose under this plan, where they might not have had as much opportunity to pick from different brands and so forth in the fact. And I will grant that. However, choice when it comes to a bill that's before us that is specifically about an insurance mandate is an odd choice of words. There is no choice. Essentially, every person who is buying an insurance policy in this state, whether they are an individual, whether they are a small business or a large business, will now be forced to buy this insurance plan with this added choice for the policyholders. And sure, it's an interesting thing because insurance mandate bills come before our committee, month after month when we are there. And every one of them is a good idea. Every one of them is an opportunity for more people to have access to more types of insurance coverage and more types of health care. Obviously, that's a good thing. The problem is that every time you do that, you end up making the plan more expensive. As I described, this is why we are in the situation we are in. Obamacare has failed because it has attempted to increase the amount of things that it covers beyond what can be afforded. And when that happens, the system breaks down. And ultimately, the quality of health care breaks down. And people end up being forced without insurance. Even if they're buying a policy, they have no insurance because it becomes unusable when you have a $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 deductible. I'm just looking at my notes here about the number of insurance mandates that we have in the state of Connecticut, and I believe the number is over 60, which is certainly in the top percentile across the country, which is why we have some of the highest insurance premiums in the country. And that is because it is very difficult when someone proposes a bill that comes before our committee and says, we want to require all insurance companies to include this new coverage. Well, of course, it's great. These new coverages are great because people will benefit from them. But every time we do, we tick the price up another $1 or $4 or another $8. And this is not a partisan concern. The governor of this state, which I would argue is not the most frugal gentleman, he's even expressed concern about it and put a bill forward this year to require us to review the insurance mandates that come before our committee. We had a bill this year, which I wish I had in front of me, that passed unanimously out of the insurance committee with both myself and the chairman supporting it, saying that any new insurance mandates that came before the state of Connecticut, we want them reviewed. And basically, they would be reviewed for their need, how they're going to affect insurance premiums, what population would be affected, so that we could make intelligent decisions as a state government about what insurance policies and plans should look like so they are affordable so people have access to insurance. and because it's a difficult trap. When you are sitting there, you'd never want to say no. You're not in favor of providing this additional coverage. But in the back of your mind, you know it's going to cost money and lead to the very problem that we have now. We, in fact, have a law on the books. It is, forgive me, 38A-21, which is our mandate review process that exists in current law. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the chairman if this proposal and the new insurance mandate that exists in here, contraception and so on, was reviewed based on 38A-21. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no, it was not.
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, I wonder why, I don't want to get myself in trouble here. The thing is that we say and do a lot of things in here. And ultimately, some of those things contradict one another. And this is just one example, and I don't want to call out my friend and colleague or anyone else in this building. I just want to encourage all of us that when we are talking to people about the cost of insurance and the number of insurance mandates that are out there, that we should have one position, which is that we should only have the insurance benefits that can reasonably be afforded by consumers. And we want to be smart about that and do our due diligence to pick and choose what those are. And for us to have passed a bill out of the same committee unanimously this year, at the same time, to say that we must review these mandates at the same time we're creating maybe the largest mandate that we've ever had in this state, I just find it shocking. There's a lot of things I could go through the bill and talk about. In fact, I'm hearing that there are a couple of errors in the way that the bill is drafted. It's not a concern. I'm sure that somehow we'll find a way to address those things. I just want to sum up my comments by reminding everyone that we are all here for the same purpose. We are here because we have been elected to act on behalf of our neighbors, to make intelligent decisions about public policy. And I understand that there is a battle of ideologies here and across our country. And I see it all the time where we put the ideology aside, and I'm pleased when that happens. People outside of this building may not realize that we pass a great number of things unanimously, or nearly so, maybe 70% or more of what we do. But sometimes there are things where we are just plainly going to disagree. Could be the death penalty, or the size of our government, or whether or not we offer choice to consumers on the type of insurance they purchase. There are plenty of ways to improve the insurance marketplace. Year after year, I have tried to introduce legislation in this building to make sure that insurance products that are sold are regulated properly by what I believe is the appropriate authority, the Connecticut Insurance Department, that we as an insurance committee review thoroughly all of the proposals that come before us to make intelligent decisions about what is best for the citizens of this state, about what we are going to require of insurance carriers, always keeping in mind the value of benefits and the cost of benefits. I put forward ideas that lean towards the free market because that's where I come from. I believe that one of the dangers that faces us in the insurance industry is the slow decline in the number of insurance companies that are willing to do business in our state. People probably don't know that our insurance exchange only has 2 insurance companies on it. And I think that's because we have made it very difficult for people who want to invest in the insurance industry to operate here successfully. And part of that is because we don't give them any opportunity to decide for themselves what their business should look like. And that's dangerous because the more competition we chase away, that means that they have less reason to compete with one another, and therefore premiums will rise. I believe that we should encourage competition in the insurance industry. We should also stop micromanaging things like preventive care. Insurance companies are not stupid. They want to make money, and they realize that the way to make money is to have a healthy population that doesn't put in insurance claims. They don't need us to give them advice about making sure that their policyholders have preventive care. They've been aware of it long before us, and left to their own devices, they would come up with even better ideas. But it has become so difficult for them because we are constantly telling them what they must do. The state of Connecticut has probably no less than 5 different state agencies that are affecting the policy for what we have for healthcare and insurance. And many of them are in direct conflict with one another. We have the Access Health Board, which I would argue, based on the language in this bill before us, doesn't even have a reason to exist any longer, since they're the ones that would be tasked with determining what our plans would look like. And this bill essentially eliminates that from the possibility in our law. There's the Office of the Healthcare Advocate. There's the Insurance Department. There is the new Office of Healthcare. What is it? Strategy. That's right, the Office of Healthcare. I can't even keep them straight. That's how many there are. Ultimately, this debate boils down to one simple thing, which is, do you believe that it is proper for us to tell consumers what they must purchase as far as health insurance, or do you believe that consumers should be able to decide for themselves? This bill seems to be focused on women's health care. If you respect women, if you respect that they know what's best for themselves, then you let them decide for themselves what type of insurance to choose. You don't decide for them. You do not take away the choice for them to decide what is the best option for their health care. I want to see every one of us, every one of our constituents, be able to make their own decision about what is best for them. And I agree with the chairman that access is important and these coverages should be available. They are available. And to make sure that they are available, I have an amendment, Mr. Speaker. The clerk has an amendment. It is LCO 4279. I'd like that it be called and I be allowed to summarize.
Will the clerk please call LCO 4279, which will be designated House Amendment Schedule B.
LCO number 4279, designated House Amendment Schedule B, introduced by Representative Sampson.
I believe this representative seeks leave of the chamber to summarize the amendment. Is there objections to summarization? Is there objection? Hearing none, Representative Sampson, you may proceed with summarization.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very simple amendment. It essentially takes Section 3 and Section 4 of the bill before us, which is the part that includes the new insurance mandates that do not exist in our current law. Some, in fairness, some of them are in current law, but the contraception piece, for instance, is not in our current law. And instead of mandating it, as the title of the bill says, and saying that every person must have this coverage and pay for it, whether they have a need, use, or desire for it, changes it to say that insurance companies shall offer such a coverage. I move adoption, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the chamber is adoption of House Amendment Schedule B. Will you remark on the amendment? Remark further, Representative Sampson?
Yes, I would like a roll when the time, a roll call vote when the time comes. And I will just simply say that this, to me...
Representative Sampson, just give me a chance here. So the representative asked for a roll call vote. All in favor of a roll call vote signify by saying aye. Aye. Okay, the vote, 20% has been reached. When the roll is taken, it'll be taken by, when the vote is taken, it'll be taken by roll. You want to proceed?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Forgive me, I just didn't want to go out of turn. We need to decide who we are as a state, as a country. And the thing we need to decide is how much we want to retain our roots as Americans. People that chose to take a tremendous risk to make sure that they could live their lives and choose their own path. Freedom is what I'm talking about. And this particular amendment essentially restores a tiny bit of freedom to say that insurance consumers, particularly women, should be able to decide for themselves whether a certain package of insurance coverages is right for them. This makes it quite clear that the access will be there because insurance companies will have to provide this coverage. But the ultimate choice about whether the person should spend the money and have the coverage is up to that person and not to us. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment before us because it's the right thing to do if you believe and respect that our neighbors are smart enough to decide for themselves what insurance they should purchase. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend, Representative Sampson, for raising this amendment, and I look forward to discussing this with a little bit. A question for the proponent of the amendment, through you, Mr. Speaker.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm wondering if the good gentleman, ranking member, would explain to me, in his understanding, as to how mandates come about in the first place. What is the genesis of mandates, through you, Mr. Speaker?
Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pretty broad question, but I would say that a mandate, by definition, is something where we, as a state legislature, pass a law requiring someone to do something, whether it be an insurance company must offer a coverage by law or a town or a school board must perform some act because we say so by law. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. You know, when I was given the tremendous honor by the Speaker to chair this committee, I had never even been on the Insurance Committee before, and I have zero background in insurance. But over the last year and a half, I have come to understand and appreciate the word mandate because I hear it a lot in my committee, and Representative Sampson and I talk a lot about mandates. And in my experience, since I became the chair of this committee, I've discovered that almost all of the mandates that come to us, and the representative alluded to this earlier, are from people who have had bad experiences with something and come to us looking for change. And somebody once told me that the best part of being an elected official is seeing anything that's happening and being able to go to work and try to do something about that. And I think that we have a very important role on the Insurance Committee of trying to vet out good and bad ideas. And I particularly, since I've had this gig, have been extra cautious about the number of new mandates that come before us. And Representative Sampson alluded to earlier the mandate review bill, and it's something I did, in fact, support, and I do continue to support. But we have an obligation, I believe, as legislators, as elected officials, as citizens of this state, to listen to the concerns of constituents and try to go to work and do something about it. And I would venture to guess, I was not in Congress at the time this bill passed. I certainly didn't have a vote up or down on this. But I know for a fact from talking to my constituents that this stuff in the essential health benefits in this bill didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of the fact that for generations, people struggled to attain better health care for themselves, their families, and their loved ones. And the price of having better health care and how the whole system works is to spread risk around through the entire marketplace. And so all of us pay for things every day that we don't use as part of our premiums because other people use them. And if only the people who needed to use those parts of their policies were paying for them, the coverage for those things would be astronomical. Because if only people who had cancer paid for insurance that covered cancer treatment, there would be no way that the insurance companies could survive, which is why all of us have to accept the risk when we accept the proposition of how insurance works. So I would say to my good friend and to all my colleagues here that I understand what he's trying to get at here, but I believe that it defeats the purpose of the underlying bill, which is to ensure that the benefits that people work so hard for and that our constituents do appreciate and look at with, I won't say joy because that's probably the wrong word, but they look at it with appreciation of the fact that they know they have the right to those services. I believe by getting rid of that, we jeopardize the services for everybody. And I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, through you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to make a couple of final remarks to sum up and let others speak about the bill before us. I think it's unfortunate that the amendment did not pass. One of the things I always ask myself whenever there is a bill before this chamber and I'm in a position to have to vote yay or nay on it, is I ask myself whether or not I personally, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you maybe get me a little quiet?
We're asked to, if you could make the room a little quiet, please. The gentleman is having trouble hearing. Especially the tall people in the back. Continue, Representative Ransom. Representative Sampson, sorry.
I'm very much obliged, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. As I was saying, whenever bills come before this chamber, and I know I'm in a position to either vote yes or no, one of the questions I always ask myself is whether or not I am so important that I have the right to make this decision for my constituents. And people that have watched my votes in this chamber know that I vote no quite often. And that's because I come to the conclusion quite often that we are doing things here beyond the wishes and desires of our constituents. I don't want to go back to the founding of our country, but one thing we need to remember is that we have a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is there to guarantee the rights of every individual. It does not guarantee the rights of a majority or what some small majority of people thinks is best for everyone else. And I'm afraid that's what has happened in many, many of the policy decisions we make. And this is just another one where we will be deciding for every individual in the state Whether they want this or not, they must have it. And we have so many choices just like this one, where the yes vote means that we tell every person whether they want the end result or not, that they have to live with it. But the no vote says it's up to the person. And that's why I'm going to be a no on this bill, Mr. Speaker, because at the end of the day, I think that the more moral, proper decision for me to make, and only from my perspective based on my ideology, I understand that others feel that the government has a role to decide these things for people. I just don't. I think that the most powerful entity that there is in our country and our state is the individual person. They should be first when it comes to making decisions, and we are way down the list at deciding what's right for every other person in our state. I'll just wrap up by making the 3 final points that I started this with. This bill, to me, has an awful title because it implies that somehow it's creating benefits for women, children, and adolescents. It's not doing that at all. Those benefits exist. And as I already pointed out, the best solution is to allow people to choose whether they want to buy them or not, of their own free will. The other words in the title are more concerning to me. An act mandating insurance coverage, mandated health benefits. That mandate is a requirement. It is an order. It is telling people, you must do this. I don't ever like to tell people they must do anything. I think people should decide for themselves what they do. I really hope that we go back to the notion of trusting our constituents. You know, on many other issues, it seems that people grasp this much more. People often say that women should have the right to choose. And of course, they're talking about what to do with their own bodies. To me, this bill is about women choosing what is right for their own health care. And sadly, this bill takes away that choice. I trust women. I trust men. I trust my constituents, my neighbors, my friends to make the right choice for themselves. I don't believe I have the right to decide for them what is best. So that's one. This bill takes away, disenfranchises, in fact, individual citizens from making their own health decisions. Second, while most of the bill is dedicated to the eventuality, if it happens or not, of Obamacare being repealed on a federal level, the other part of the bill creates new insurance mandates, and that will increase premiums. Make no mistake, if you vote for this bill, you are voting to increase the insurance premium for your constituents. And finally, and probably worst of all, it perpetuates the disaster that is Obamacare in our state law. I hope they repeal Obamacare in Washington. I know there's a big debate about what to do and this and that, but I will tell you that things were better before Obamacare. They were not perfect. They were not even good, but they were better. And I think we have a real opportunity if our state is given free will for Representative Scanlon and I to sit down as members of the Insurance Committee and talk about what we should do to actually improve the insurance marketplace. But to simply take the failed policy on a federal level and insert it into our state law as if it's a victory is a mistake. It's a mistake that will cost the citizens of this state in the cost of their health care and the quality of it. We have seen it across our country. Why do we want to do this to our citizens? So, Mr. Speaker, that's it. If you vote for this bill, it is because you believe Obamacare is a good thing. I don't. You are okay with increasing the cost of insurance on each of your constituents. I am not. And you have to be okay with deciding for them about their own personal health care decisions. And I am not, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. I'll be voting no.